Okay, this is the second part of the 5.02 lesson, The War in Vietnam. And we were finishing up our reading for today. So continuing on with From Search and Destroy to Rolling Thunder. Johnson appointed General William Westmoreland, a veteran of World War II in Korea, to command American forces in Vietnam. Westmoreland conceived an aggressive strategy for the war. American forces would launch search and destroy missions against communist forces in South Vietnam, employing their superior firepower to obliterate the enemy. At the same time, American air forces would bomb North Vietnam in order to shatter the country's capacity to make war. The American leadership expected an easy victory, but it underestimated the tenacity and fighting skills of the communist forces. Avoiding head-on conflict with large American units, the Viet Cong used hit-and-run tactics like those employed by the Viet Minh against the French. In Ho Chi Minh's terms, the Viet Cong tiger was now bleeding the American elephant. Meanwhile, the North poured troops and supplies southward along the so-called Ho Chi Minh Trail, a vast network of roads, bridges, and paths threading through the eastern Laos and eastern Cambodia before entering South Vietnam. As part of Operation Rolling Thunder, the American air campaign against the North Vietnamese, U.S. planes relentlessly bombed the Ho Chi Minh Trail. But thanks to a sophisticated system of underground barracks, storage facilities, and hospitals, men and supplies continued to flow down the trail. The number of North Vietnamese Army (NVA) troops fighting in South Vietnam increased from about 35,000 in 1965 to some 90,000 in 1967. Beginning in 1966, American airstrikes were increasingly concentrated on military and industrial targets in North Vietnam. In the 3 years of Operation Rolling Thunder, the U.S. dropped about 643,000 bombs on the North, but North Vietnam, by mobilizing its entire population, was able to complete quick repairs to most of the damage caused by the bombing. As one North Vietnamese civilian said, the Americans thought that the more bombs they dropped, the quicker we would fall to our knees and surrender, but the bombs heightened rather than dampened our spirit. Meanwhile, in the South, the ground war dragged on. Along the demilitarized zone between the two countries, American and NVA troops pounded each other with artillery. In the jungle areas farther south, U.S. and South Vietnamese forces tracked an elusive enemy. To support his strategy of search and destroy, General Westmoreland called for more and more soldiers. In what became known as the escalation of the war, the number of U.S. troops in Vietnam shot up from 184,000 in 1965 to 385,000 in 1966, 486,000 in 1967, rising to a peak of 540,000 in 1969. Waging a jungle war. In full-scale battles against the Viet Cong or NVA forces, American troops almost always prevailed. But the enemy generally avoided large engagements, preferring to strike quickly and then blend back into the countryside. Sympathetic villagers protected the Viet Cong fighters. As one Marine veteran recalled, they all dressed alike. They were all Vietnamese. Some of them are Viet Cong. It wasn't like the San Francisco 49ers on one side of the field and the Cincinnati Bengals on the other. The enemy was all around you. In Vietnam, there were no front lines. The goal of the soldiers was not, as had been in most of America's previous wars, to seize and hold territory. Instead, their commanders ordered them to kill as many of the enemy as possible. Leaders measured success in body counts, reported numbers of the dead NVA or Viet Cong. But no matter how high the body counts grew, they reached 220,000 by late 1967. The enemy showed no sign of giving up. Combat in Vietnam was a tense and frustrating experience. On their search and destroy missions, American soldiers lived in constant fear of stepping on landmines, triggering booby-trapped grenades, or tumbling into hidden pits full of sharpened bamboo stakes. The country's terrain and climate exacted a fierce physical toll. Most of the Vietnamese countryside was made up of densely wooded hills where the Viet Cong hid themselves among the local civilian population. Wearing 60 to 70 pounds of equipment on their backs, suffocated by heat and tormented by insects, soldiers struggled through dense jungle or slogged across flooded rice paddies. Amid crushing heat and heavy rain, often going days without sleep, soldiers and Marines had to make life or death decisions about which Vietnamese were civilians and which were aligned with the Viet Cong. American soldiers did have the advantage of the most advanced weaponry on Earth. Helicopters transported troops into battle and then rained down machine gun fire on the enemy. Fighter pilots bombed enemy troops on the ground, often with a chemical jelly called napalm that clung to the skin of its victims and burned them to death. Since communist fighters hid in areas thick with foliage, American planes sprayed a highly toxic herbicide, plant killer, called Agent Orange, destroying at least 10% of the country's forest. Many South Vietnamese civilians were caught in the devastation unleashed by American firepower. Villages close to the fighting were sometimes destroyed by U.S. soldiers Villages close to the fighting were sometimes destroyed by U.S. artillery and airstrikes. In some cases, American soldiers deliberately attacked civilians. In March 1968, an American platoon massacred as many as 500 men, women, and children in the small village of My Lai because they suspected them of supporting the Viet Cong. Lieutenant William Calley, the platoon commander at My Lai, was tried for murder by court-martial, convicted, and jailed. The enemy, too, treated civilians brutally. Throughout the war, the Viet Cong fighters assassinated village headmen and others who opposed them, and they targeted civilians as a way of intimidating the population. The war's single greatest atrocity occurred a few months after My Lai, when North Vietnamese troops captured the city of Hue. The Communists murdered more than 3,000 people, many of whom they burned alive. The soldiers' experience. The number of factors made service in Vietnam especially difficult. Tensions arose between American troops and their South Vietnamese allies, whom the Americans sometimes accused of being reluctant to fight. In fact, many South Vietnamese soldiers fought fiercely. An estimated 250,000 perished in combat, but they were hampered by the corruption and incompetence of their top commanders. At the same time, racial tensions rose within American ranks. Black troops complained of getting the hardest, most dangerous assignments. Especially at the beginning of the war, African Americans suffered a disproportionate share of casualties. The terrifying nature of the war, with its hidden enemy and constant fear of booby traps or ambush, was heightened by the youth of those who fought it. In World War II in Korea, the average age of a soldier was 26. In Vietnam, only 19. Many had gone to Vietnam reluctantly after being drafted. Draftees accounted for more than half the Army's battle deaths. At the beginning of the war, troop morale was generally high, but as the conflict dragged on into its 4th, 5th, and 6th years, both morale and discipline suffered. Young and impressionable, most Marines and soldiers on the front lines confronted unspeakable levels of stress and confusion. Many soldiers took refuge in drugs. An Army study showed that in 1971, half of all soldiers had smoked marijuana and many had tried heroin. Sometimes troops would attack their own officers in an attempt to stay out of combat, a practice known as fragging. Between 1970 and 73, the desertion rate for American Marine Corps soldiers in Vietnam was several times higher than what it had been in World War II in Korea. Okay, and then we'll stop here, but let's go back. There were some excerpts that I skipped over as we were going through. Okay, here, the Imperial Presidency. Lyndon Johnson was emboldened to escalate the Vietnam War by his landslide victory in 1964, as well as by the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. But critics charged that he was grabbing power by claiming the power to make war, which the Constitution grants to Congress. In response to such criticism, Johnson became even more obstinate in his conviction that communism must be halted in Southeast Asia. Arthur Schlesinger Jr., a noted American historian, would later describe Johnson's actions as one stage in the evolution of what he called the Imperial Presidency. Since the 1930s, American presidents had gradually claimed broader powers not asserted by previous chief executives. LBJ and later Richard Nixon's conduct of the war in Vietnam seemed to Schlesinger a dangerous embodiment of this increase in executive power. And were there any excerpts here? No, but this is a very famous picture that came. Vietnamese children flee in terror after a U.S. bombing raid of suspected Viet Cong hiding places, bombing in their village. Okay, and we'll stop here. We'll go back to the lesson. Make sure that you check your reading guide, cross-reference it with the lesson answer key to make sure you got the right answers, and let's continue on. Okay, there's a reflection on war activity. Reflections on war. Looking back at an event is often different from living through it. The passage of time gives people a chance to reflect on the impact the events have had on their lives. So it is with soldiers from the Vietnam War. In this activity, we'll explore these feelings that still linger in the lives of Americans who served in the Vietnam War. Print the Reflections on War sheet and follow the directions to complete the activity. So you can get it from your materials, your lesson resources, Reflections on War. There are many primary sources on the Vietnam War, including newspaper accounts, diaries, photographs, and position papers. Visit the two websites detailed below to read about the personal experiences of several Vietnam veterans. As you read, think about how their lives were changed by their experiences in Vietnam. All right, so the first one, read the poems First Encounter and Natural History. Okay, First Encounter. You have stopped for a break. Stand up, put your gear on, and hear shots. See the flash of the muzzles. You have been followed. The whiteness of the branches that have been cut along the way tells you are on a new trail, but the sergeant is a stateside GI. Barracks inspections, rules and regs. You are probably surrounded. There are 5 others beside you. You are 23. You look quickly around you, the sky, the trees. You're far from home. You know now that your life is no longer yours. And natural history was the other one, correct? Yes. To cross the river meant leeches. A company of NVAs crashing toward you would be a troop of baboons. A green snake named Mr. Two-Step for the number you'd last after bitten. It was said the NVAs carried flashlights. One night, frightening scores of them turned out to be a swarm of fireflies. The whir of birds' wings turned out to be artillery rounds. Threw stones at a cobra once, the sun going down, fire at it. Fire at it, and the VC would know our position. A VC moving slowly in the elephant grass happened to be a water buffalo. One night they overran the compound, loaded it down with grenades, AK-47s from North Vietnam, mines strapped to their chests. These were only the mosquitoes. The VC only a little more than a whisper's reach away. We called them the cobras. They came in hissing. Cannons twice as fast as the old gunships. It was also said the VC kept chickens leashed to strings. So easily frightened they were perfect warning. One night, shivering uncontrollably with fear, knowing I would have to kill whatever was out there, walking, slowly scratching. Okay, and then the other one, POV, Vietnam Stories Since the War. Read the selections Movie and Healing. Okay, movie. It's like an old war movie I saw once with singular difference that I had a bit part in the action. The slightest familiar odor or sound can bring these memories racing back. A jog in the memory can make me hear the slap of the rotor blades and feel their thump and vibrate my insides. My memory can hear 3 radios squawking and the crew all talking at once over my headset. I marvel now how I could possibly understand them all and continue to function. But it's the odors that come haunting. In Vietnam I worked low in the air and my sense of smell was subjected to odors which it permanently cataloged. The smell of burnt gunpowder or fireworks today can quickly make my pulse rise and transport me far away in place and time. Long rainy days bring me my nostrils the heavy wetness of the jungle, perfumed with tropical blossoms and mixed with rotting vegetation. The scent of garlic browning and oil takes me back to flying over Saigon, where your nose was struck in alternate waves with a wonderful bouquet of flowers, the stench of garbage, and frying garlic. A blast of black exhaust from a diesel engine brings to mind the early morning pre-flight swathed in Joe the shipburner's smoke created from burning human excrement in JP4 or diesel fuel. Movies of Vietnam portraying authentic-looking grunts can flood my mind with the odor of their animal sweat mingled with the rot of the jungle clinging to them after days in the field. It can make me smell wounded grunts as they hop or are carried, pulled, hoisted, or half thrown in deadly urgency aboard our dust-off Huey. And I swear I can smell their blood too. It was a smell that came often. Some impressions I want to remember, some I do not, but I have got them all burned somewhere deep in my mind. And the other one, healing. My father and I were not terribly close. While we did find ways to move closer in the last 10 years of his life, there were very few things we had in common. One of them was golf, and the other that we both served in the Navy during the war. He in World War II in the Pacific and me in Vietnam in the South Pacific. But we never really talked about our experiences until one day, when we were on our way to play golf, we stopped to have breakfast. All of a sudden, the conversation became very serious. I told him something I had felt for a long time, but I never said out loud. I said, "You are the lucky generation." He looked at me in kind of a strange way. I wanted to tell him that his was the last generation that grew up believing there was a man on the moon. I grew up knowing there had been a man on the moon. His was the last generation that grew up in rural communities untouched by modern technology and knowing of all that is going on in the world. I grew up in the information age, knowing everything, seeing everything, watching history unfold in front of my well-worn TV eyes. His was the last generation that grew up having the full American dream intact. Mine was the generation who saw the American dream tarnished by Watergate and other political corruption. Finally, and this is when it got very serious, I said his was a generation who was able to come home after fighting in a war, not only knowing what you did was necessary, but everyone around you knew it too. My generation fought in a war we did not understand, and when we came home we were demonstrated against, spit on, yelled at, shunned, and left alone. We had no justification, no heroes, no protection of the heart, no treatment for the wounded no one could see. We were left on our own to figure it out by ourselves, and many of us, unable to deal with the reality of what we did and what we saw, did the logical thing to survive. The only thing we could do to survive. We buried it. We buried it in the deep place inside where no one could see, no one could touch, no one could hurt. Some buried it so deep they withdrew from the world around us and have never been able to re-enter. And I'm going to stop here, even though there's another paragraph too for you to read through on your own. But don't forget then to go to the reflections on war sheet, fill out those things. You can check them with the lesson answer key, and then also complete the 5.0